delighted to be here to discuss a new book that has just come out. It's called The Self-Deception Trap. You would have seen it, Exploring the Economic Dimensions of Charity Dependency Within Africa-Europe Relations. We're here today with the author of this book, Professor Carlos Lopes, formerly of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and also the high-level representative for the AU to negotiate with the European Union. We've written a couple of book reviews in New African and African Business about his latest book, one which concludes his critique, detailed at length in this impressive text, should garner attention at the highest level of EU-Africa policymaking. And in another conclusion, it says, this is a remarkable book that deserves a huge readership. We'll get to the intricacies and details of the book and why it was written, and also the structure, the chosen structure of Professor Lopes in terms of defining the self-deception trap and EU-African relations. But Prof, welcome. It's great to have you, and I thoroughly enjoyed the book. It was, I was actually a little bit surprised in terms of the journey. It took me on an unexpected journey. Maybe we can also talk about some of the anecdotes and your real life experiences in terms of EU-African relations. But first of all, maybe tell us the reason for writing this book, and then we'll also discuss the structure in a second. But what were the reasons for writing this book? What spurred you on? Was it despair? Was it frustration? Or was it actually you're seeing structural shifts and structural changes that deserve a forensic analysis? And this is really a forensic and pretty technical book. And actually, the way I saw it in some stages, in some chapters, a therapist's approach to dealing with underlying traumas. So, but maybe what was the reason for writing this book that spurred you on?
Well, thank you for having me. And certainly you put it quite well. I think it's therapy for me first, because I was frustrated not being able to deliver what is important for the continent during the mandate as High Representative for the African Union. And I thought the reasons needed to be explained, reasons that are quite deep-rooted and that deserve to be understood by as many as possible, because they are likely to continue to repeat themselves. The issues that the book addresses are very much enshrined in the idea that comes from medicine, that you can indulge in self-deception when you actually don't realize that you are actually binding the reality to meet your own needs.
Okay, so the AU actually comes out of your book pretty well. I was expecting more criticism of our own institutions on our own mechanisms, but actually, I mean, you do mention some of the flaws of and the institution's own weaknesses, but ultimately, the AU seems to be well-intentioned. It seems to have fought through its position. It seems to have set its stance and priorities pretty clearly, but ultimately, it's negotiating with quote unquote, well, it's not quoting, I'm quoting, unquoting, an abusive partner. So you don't mention the EU as an abusive partner, but the way I look at it, you're negotiating with someone with an abusive partner who's not ready to change their ways. So ultimately, the AU comes out of it well in that it set out its priorities. It was pretty transparent. It was clear. It articulated its position in an honest manner. But ultimately, the other party just wasn't willing to listen.
Well, make no mistake, I think self-deception applies to both ends. Definitely, there is a self-deception on the part of the European actors when they think that what they are doing is altruistic and it's going to help Africa transform itself and eventually get to growth and development. But there is also self-deception on the part of the African actors that tend to believe that because of aid, because of the possibilities of assistance, it's worth, sort of bending their own rules. And therefore, their agency may manifest itself very clearly in some proclamations. And definitely, I was part of the groups that pushed for a very clear agenda in relation to the engagements with Europe. But then, the determination to implement that agenda is not at all corresponding to what we expected, because basically people are very vulnerable to divide and rule tactics employed by the European Union. So, in fact, I think it's frustrating both sides.
But when you say self-deception, is it self-deception, or is it short-term self-interest ultimately that certain countries and certain leaders were after?
Well, the way one defines self-deception is very much corresponding to the idea of self-interest. So when you have a certain number of very important issues for you, you tend to actually interpret the reality to meet exactly what you want, and not necessarily what you are seeing, or not necessarily what you should deliver or engage. And therefore, there is a refraining of actually listening to the interlocutor. So there is a tendency for you to sort of make up your mind before you even heard the other point of view. And that's very much the way negotiations still are between Europe and Africa. The Europeans being more powerful, they tend to actually make up their mind. And this was very clear during the negotiations that I was in charge of conducting, because they had a strategy for Africa, and they refused to admit that the Africans could have a strategy for Europe. And they did everything to undermine that Africa could actually put forward such an agenda, and therefore using the argument that the Africans were not organized.
Okay, and tell me, in terms of this, let's get to the structure of the book. When I say it took me on an unexpected journey, because it takes you on a historical journey of colonialism and everything that entailed. But ultimately, what I think the message that you're sending is the vestiges of colonialism are very much alive and kicking on the continent. But one thing that you don't mention, and maybe that we see today, is the young generation are probably less impacted by this colonial complex or colonial attachment, and actually more free thinking, more confident, more internationalist in their approach, and less tied to Europe or any other colonial power.
Well, the reason I go into a historical band is precisely to demonstrate that structurally the economies of Africa are continuing the same characteristics, path, and structure of the colonial times. So they continue to be mostly commodity exporters. They continue to be vulnerable to trade regimes that are unfavorable to them. They continue to be trapped in problems of debt that are related to access to capital. So when you look into the different characteristics of the African economies today, you recognize exactly the same as during the colonial times. And I think the youth of today are very conscious that this is so. That's not the part they are in disagreement. The part they are in disagreement is what we do about it. And they criticize the leadership of the continent for being too lenient in the way it engages the other partners, not just Europe, and not defending enough African interests. And I'm with them on that. So what I try to demonstrate is that this agency is only possible if you are extremely cautious and sophisticated in the way you handle different, very important regulatory systems that exist worldwide that have been constructed on the base of colonial times. And I think that is the reason why the book had to be a bit more technical in some aspects. Like, for instance, if you are talking about climate, you need to be much more convincing about why new forms of taxation are not going to be favorable to Africa. You cannot just say it as a slogan. You have to explain why. If you are saying that the trade agreements that we have right now are not favorable, you have to demonstrate why market access is some of the very important premises that people believe in don't make any sense, and they are completely trapped into a logic that is not favorable to the continent.
So I'll get to Africans in the global multilateral system and in their role in terms of or where they stand in terms of global discourse. But again, in terms of your analysis, and as I said, this is it's a very forensic approach in terms of trying to understand why we are where we are, and you go back you go back in time to really show how things have evolved or they have not evolved. If anything, we're still stuck in a structural flawed system, structurally flawed in that it's still the same system as it was all those years ago. And I'll get to that as well in a second. But you take what you seem to be saying as well is a lot of today's thinking is still based on classical thinkers and economists, so Western thinkers such as Ricardo in terms of the comparative advantage and trade, Malthus in terms of his population thesis, and so you think that there needs to be a complete new paradigm shift in terms of how we think about these problems, because the solutions that have been preferred to Africa are essentially flawed.
I try to demonstrate, Omar, that there are lots of good intentions, but good intentions have proven to be not necessarily wrong all the times, and most of the times, and that the good Samaritan approach is not going to make the trick. And we don't need to go far. We just need to go back 2-3 decades and see what countries have been able to transform themselves structurally to understand what they have done differently from the African sort of experiment. And we end up, recognizing that certain types of conceptual frames are trapping us into self-deception. One of them, a very important one, that's why I devote a lot of time to it, is precisely the theory of comparative advantages, because it's a theory that basically puts Africa always on the map because of its mineral resources, its extractive potential, and the like. And this is the reason why we are commodity dependent. This is the reason why all the advice that we receive from international institutions, particularly international financial institutions, but only recently you can see a bit of a questioning. And that's why I think it's important for us to not hesitate to challenge these conceptual frames, because we have gotten so used to them that we think it's fine. So for me, it's very rewarding that when the book was reviewed by the likes of Danny Roderick, of Arjun Chang, people that are really quite known for being trade specialists worldwide, they found it important, fascinating, excruciating at times, but definitely it's because it touches these conceptual frames and challenges them quite profoundly.
No, I mean it took me back to the days of kicking away the ladder, and whereby the proponents of free trade today ultimately were the greatest protectionists back when they led their industrial transformation. So the UK, the US, and others,
and they are doing it again, and they are doing it again.
Yeah, and we'll get to the international framework and international regulation. But again, I just wanted to look at the structural issues, because I remember you saying once, I mean, you don't actually say it in this book, but I remember you saying that ultimately what the problem with colonial leadership is we've taken the structures, so the structural flaws of our economies, which means that we're still treating our people as servants as opposed to citizens. So we've not benefited, but we've exploited, or our leaders have exploited the structures that were put in place, which were one of extraction and serfdom, as opposed to one of development and equal growth.
Yes, people will say country X is doing fine, or country Y has no debt problems because they are able to meet their international obligations. They are not judged in terms of whether they meet their domestic obligations. So it's completely reverse of what development is about. So it's how do I make sure that I have enough balance of payments, macroeconomic indicators that would allow me to pay my debt service. And even if I pay the highest interest rates in the world and so on, the questioning is not about whether that is fair, because all countries have developed with a certain level of access to capital, and Africa doesn't have that. So it's about 1% of the credit of the world. So it's very low, to not say ridiculous. It's all about this sort of how do I get recognized internationally, and this of course goes into the realm of politics. Then it becomes, how do I make sure that my regime survives because it has international recognition of sorts, even though I can practice internally, sort of engagements that are dictatorial and others. So what makes or breaks my situation as an African leader is the international recognition, and because of that we become completely obedient to certain types of interpretations of reality. And that's what the book is also trying to challenge. So it's not just on economics. It tries to go into some of these very important distinctions that we need to understand. The complexity of a part of the population being treated as subjects and others as citizens, as being called by Mahmoud Bandani and other authors as a very important contribution for us to understand the institutional longevity of the colonial administration.
Mm. And tell me, in terms of the free trade, again, you've actually got two chapters on it. You've got, I believe, I'll get to the chapters in a second. Yes, but the comparative advantage chapter, and also the fallacy of, or the fantasy of, free trade. So it's obviously extremely important. But I mean, what are you advocating there in terms of our maybe negotiating stance, or how we should approach it? Should we be more protectionist? Should we be smarter and more strategic in terms of our regulatory framework, if when we're inviting FDI into our countries? What are you advocating there?
What I'm advocating is smart protectionism, to make it short. And what I'm trying to bring in the book is the reality that has impeded the implementation of a smart protectionist attitude and agency. Uh, in the first chapter is more the historical dimensions of that, and the other chapter on the fallacy of free trade is about how we negotiate and how badly we negotiate, because we are not capable of actually understanding some of the nuances that have trapped Africa into a logic that is not in its favor.
Mm. And you're pretty critical of IP regulation, so anything to do with intellectual property. When you speak, obviously, to people in pharma and technology, they say it's IP that drives innovation. So by knowing that your innovation is going to be, people will be restricted to using your innovation for X amount of years, actually enhances creativity, enhances innovation, and it creates the market that has been so successful to the EU, US, and today China. So what new system are you advocating there in terms of IP, or
Well,
should they be more favorable to African countries or developing countries?
yeah, it's a fallacy to think that IP is driven by the IP regimes are driven by innovation, the same way as we believe that the comparative advantages theory is right, in the sense that it depends on how you implement it. So if you have sort of a static view of comparative advantages, it's very different from a dynamic view where you identify a niche, an opportunity, a value chain, and then you make sure through determination and through very concise and very well crafted policies how you can take advantage of that opportunity. Whereas, if you are static, you just believe what the world is demand is, and therefore, if the world demand is for you to just be extractive, you stick to that. On the intellectual property, you have a similar dilemma. Intellectual property regimes are very different today from what they were just at the time of industrial revolution that propelled the richest countries today. And that's why, lots of problems with China are precisely around intellectual property, because it's defying the logic that allowed for the kicking the ladder attitude in relation to intellectual property as well. But what Africans really have to understand is that if they uh, are being, stolen part of the value of their wealth, is because of intellectual property. It's because you have created a system where the demographics are not favorable to aging countries, and therefore you have to compensate that with intellectual property. So you extract the value as much as you can from the soft part of the production system, because you are no longer in the physical production itself. You are no longer in sort of the hard contributions of the value chains, and there's nothing wrong as such with the attitude of those who can't do it are defending. Where there is a problem that I find devastating in the book is that the Africans go along without questioning it and without creating a space where they can benefit from also intellectual property regimes that are more favorable to them. And this is exactly what the Asian countries have done, and the African countries have to follow.
Mm. Okay, and so what are you calling for? You're calling for us to go and, I mean, there's talk of the global financial architecture reform right now. So reforming institutions such as the World Bank, IMF, what they stand for, and what they should be doing, and how they should be intervening, not just in Africa but across developing countries. Also asking us to challenge the rules and regulations of the WTO and the structures of the WTO, the IP rules and regulations out there. So you're asking us to actually revisit all these different treaties and organizations that were set up 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago.
Yes, I'm saying that there are two ways of going about defying the current unfavorable regimes, be it on trade, be it on intellectual property more specifically, or be it on international financial architecture. First is the using the power of numbers. We are 54 countries, so we count. It's not a coincidence that now Africans are being the subject of a courtship by major powers. Is now a member of the G20. It's increasing participation in the BRICS and all the rest. So these are indications that there is a huge interest in the geopolitical dimension of Africa. So that's one way. You have to use your numbers better. And the dividing rule that has prevailed, particularly in the engagements with Europe, has to cease. And this can only happen if the African Union becomes much more forceful in the implementation of its own decisions. And the book demonstrates that in relation to the negotiations on the post-Cotonou that I call a crash. And all these announcements like the Global Gateway that are done by Europe unilaterally without any engagements with African actors prior. The second way we should go about it is by making sure that we have an articulated proposal for each one of these different negotiations. And I think we have not been very successful in articulating what really matters. For instance, all the international financial architecture discussions and reforms are based on the principle of Africa having access to more concessional lending. I'm trying to demonstrate that the concessional lending is not going to get us anywhere, even if we get more of it. It's not structural. What we need is actually to change the prudential rules of the Bank of International Settlements. What we need is to make sure that the credit rating agencies are regulated to a certain extent, and so on and so forth. So this type of agenda that is a more ambitious is not completely possible. The Africans have demonstrated by pushing the discussions about taxation to go back to the UN when the OECD was basically trying to steal it and be the only major actor on the subject, have been noticed by all. Africa led and got it. So we need to demonstrate the same in a number of other fronts.
Fantastic. Just a quick note to all the people participating. They can submit questions, I believe, in the Q&A section, and then we'll look at them and put them to Prof in the next 10 or 15 minutes. So you just mentioned the global gateway, and probably the global gateway. If you mention it to anyone on the street, they wouldn't know what it is. I mean, most people have heard of the Belt and Roads Initiative of the Chinese, but when you speak about the Europe's global gateway, I mean, no one will say, "What is it? What have they done? Where's the money gone?" It's supposed to be competing. So maybe you can explain what the global gateway is and why such initiatives. And you speak of the plethora of initiatives out there, which actually means that every new initiative is even more meaningless than the previous one. So using a Zambian, I believe, Zambian proverb about too many cocks make the dawn last too long. So, but anyway, tell us a little bit about the global gateway, how it's supposed to compete with the Belt and Roads Initiative, and why it hasn't done so.
Well, for the negotiations, but for my own sake, I try to understand what was the meaning of so many initiatives starting in different European presidencies, both of the European Union or G20 or other bodies, and counted 51 initiatives. So Global Gateway, let's say, because I had to close my role and the book, is initiative number 52. Since then, there are two more that have been added post Global Gateway. But Initiative 52 was supposed to be the mother of all initiatives, an attempt by the European Union to federate the different contributions of its member states in relation to partnerships. And obviously, this was an attempt to respond to the big numbers that were coming from Chinese investment and Chinese ODA. So as a result, you have sort of a gimmick, which is to go into each bilateral program in Europe, try to understand how much they are likely to engage in the coming years, and then go to the European Investment Bank and other financial institutions and try to elicit from them what was their portfolio projections with private sector investment money, and then mix that with the European Union engagements themselves, and then say, well, this is the envelope. And of course, the attempt was to have the envelope sound bigger than the Chinese investments. It's completely ridiculous. There's nothing new. It's absolutely the same things with an attempt of a new cover, but obviously the cover didn't go far, because right now there is a huge criticism of the Global Gateway. There is a new commission that has just been approved, and the first order of day of that commission on partnerships was to announce a reduction of the envelope for partnerships, a quite significant one. And moreover, consider the partnerships envelope that remains to be also the one that covers most of the expenses in Ukraine, and also the one that is going to cover for migration-related protectionist measures, including the ones that are related to security. So what is left is much less than what used to be there. So if I say is nothing new, actually what is new is worse, not better. And it's very much an indication that the Africans need to wake up, because the Global Gateway was an announcement that was made 2 weeks before the summit between African and European leaders, and no consultation was done prior. Why 2 weeks? Because 2 weeks before the summit, the EU Commission President visited Dakar, made the announcement there just to make sure that it was announced in Africa and not in the summit, and that was it. So was there during the summit one single criticism from the African delegations about this announcement? No.
So what are you saying? We need to, I mean, my main message from the book, and maybe you can let us know what you want your main takeaway to be. It's to take ownership of your development narrative and your development agenda. So you obviously mentioned something else in terms of how do we go to the negotiating table, and what we need to bring to that table, and maybe we'll discuss that around the G20, which you do mention a little bit in your book in terms of making sure that we've got the right institutions within the AU to make sure that when we do go to the G20, we have got that articulated position and message. But but coming back in terms of owning our development narrative, I mean, would you say what is the main takeaway from the book? Would you say is it we need to understand what we want from development and then impose it?
I think the book has that message for sure, but with a bit more of qualification. It is about making sure that our European partners understand that out there in Africa, and the book is just a demonstration amongst others, there are people that are thinking about this partnership, would like it to work, but they are very conscious that this is not going to work if we continue to be trapped in this sort of self-deception, in this colonial attitude that is disguised with altruism. So that's for our partners. But then it's also a message for the Africans to say, look, you need to understand complexity, complexity, complexity. This is not about, simplifying the messages. It's about making sure that we understand that there is a need for us to completely review our narrative so we can engage and negotiate better. I think we have a technical problem. I didn't hear your question. I think you are frozen my end. I hope it's just my end.
I think it may be my
Yeah,
internet. Can
no,
you hear
but you
me
are
now?
back. You are back. You are back.
Okay. So, as I said, we live in a complex world and a fast-moving one, and a lot of different shifts, geopolitical and regulatory around climate. So you mentioned CBAM very quickly. You have a few paragraphs on it. CBAM, for those who don't know, is a sort of the carbon tax that the EU will be imposing on imports that are not categorized as green. And we're also seeing new regulation, for example, in terms of around soft commodities, around deforestation, whereby smallholder farmers in Africa or elsewhere, actually in Latin America, Central America, will have to prove that their coffee or other soft commodities have been grown sustainably, i.e., without degrading land or destroying forests. But obviously, this is prohibitive for many farmers who won't be able to adhere to this new regulation, and potentially costly in terms of their livelihoods. So there are seismic changes, and from the sounds of it, we're not necessarily prepared to confront some of this regulation, and we're just going to be to have it imposed upon us, and it'll be detrimental to our own future.
Well, what is fascinating about these different moves on trade is that they are supposed to be protective of climate, but then instead of taxing consumers, it taxes producers of commodities. And, it's sort of passing the buck again to Africa that, is not responsible for climate change and is the one that is going to be penalized at the end of the day because, there will be import taxation of some of its products for reasons X and Y. And I think it's quite devastating that this is being done without any negotiations prior with Africa. So which contradicts again all the proclamations about a partnership of equals. That is the preferred slogan of the European Union. That each time I try to demonstrate in the book, it is meaningless. And this is just one more proof of that. So even if there are arguments, and there are some technical arguments to say that maybe you could go the route of having some of these taxes extra retained in the country. Maybe we could make sure that there is a better utilization of the proceeds of this taxation, and so on and so forth. These arguments are not to be discussed post facto. they should have been part of an engagement, which is not the case. So it's sort of a remedial action, which is the way we always see Africa. It's just that we make up our mind because we are altruistic, we have the best of intentions, and then the Africans have to adjust. So they don't have the right to have their own view prior.
Mm. Okay, it was an interesting chapter. I've forgotten which one it was in terms of French colonies. So maybe it's in the Good Samaritan lose their way. But anyway, in terms of French colonies, keeping the colonies Mayotte and Reunion in the Indian Ocean, and ultimately for strategic reasons, for military reasons, and take advantage of the blue economy and international waters. But last week, I think it was, we saw the Chagos Islands being given away by the British. So would you say that that's strategic errors from the British in terms of giving away the Chagos Islands back to the Mauritians? Because ultimately, it's an important part of the world in terms of positioning between East and West, and also the waterways, as you say.
Well, definitely, I'm very happy for Mauritius and for Chagos and the Chagosians. But it is not something that I was expecting for the reasons I explained in the book. This has been kept because of the blue economy opportunities and geopolitical and strategic reasons. And this particular archipelago is crucial for US military bases that are using Diego Garcia for their positioning in the Indian Ocean. So for me, it was a surprise. I still have to investigate the full reasons for it to happen just now, because about a year ago, the International Court had decided in favor of Mauritius, and the UK didn't accept the verdict. So what happened in between? We need to understand. Of course, politics in the UK have changed a bit, so that explains definitely one part of the move. But there is obviously more that we need to understand.
Mm. And you, to some extent, critical in terms of the extractive industries, of course, and also how our resources have been exploited. But aren't we seeing? And you mentioned the DRC, which is, as we know, sits on a wealth of riches. But aren't you seeing positive steps in terms of mining contracts being renegotiated, be it in Zambia, be it in DRC, be it in Guinea, and Africans again taking ownership of their own needs, and negotiating in a manner that's more forthright.
Well, when I was at the Economic Commission for Africa, we championed the African mining vision, and in fact, it was elaborated during the time of my predecessor, but I was the one who promoted it to become a crucial policy endorsed by the African Union. And one of the characteristics that we were trying to make clear and that have been adopted since is the fact that we needed to have much better deals, number one. But second, much better knowledge also of the potential that exists in our shores. And for a variety of reasons, we need also this technical competence that would allow us to negotiate, taking into account the two above. And I think right now, what you are seeing is sort of the collateral positive effects of the Africa mining vision. Because after having been adopted, you have a rollout period where it has been the subject of a lot of discussions in different regional economic communities in Africa. And then, countries specifically have taken a stance, and then others have sort of followed. I always remember this anecdote. Uh, when you ask a Zambian where do they export their copper to, all Zambians will tell you to China, when in fact, on the papers they export their copper to Switzerland. So this issue of the intermediaries in commodities, taking a huge chunk of the profit and completely distorting the way trade is done, even for those commodities without value addition, is now very much up and center. Everybody's discussing them. So we are accusing some countries. The first to be accused of so was Tanzania, of resource nationalism. But in fact, it is about consciousness that is growing. about the fact that Africa's riches need to be better negotiated.
So we're, as I mentioned, we're taking questions for Prof for the next 10 minutes or so, and we've actually got one from the Deputy Director for Europe at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Regional Integration of Ghana. And he's saying, thank you for your insights. I'm wondering if you have reviewed the Africa-EU Economic Partnership Agreement. My concern is about exports from Africa to EU based on the EPA. It seems to me that the EU is restricting imports into Europe using standards and human rights issues as excuses.
Well, EPAs are strongly covered in the book and criticized because this was one more divide and rule tactic from the European Union, also because of the secrecy of the negotiations, complete lack of transparency, contrary to what we are asking African governments to adhere to. And also because the EPAs are dividing the pie in such a way that Africans become hostage of different slices, having negotiated with the number one trading partner, which is Europe, differently, therefore making the work of the Secretariat of the African Continental Free Trade Area much more difficult, because you will have to respect then agreements that are signed by different parts of the continent. So for all those reasons, it's a bad deal, and they should have been dead. In fact, EPAs have not really taken off. You have countries that are now under the EPA regimes, but not the subregions as a whole. That was supposed to be sort of the approach, with maybe the exception of Southern Africa, that has the large majority of the countries under the EPA regime. But even there, not all of them. But the others have not taken off. We just have single countries that have signed sort of interim agreements with the EU, including Ghana.
Mm. Okay, there's another question that says, what would you choose? Advocacy for more exports from Africa or calling for more foreign direct investment?
Well, it's really not either or. We need foreign direct investment, but the foreign direct investment that needs to come to the continent has to be under sort of an approach where the Africans know what they want in terms of structural transformation country per country. And that basically means that you are trying to direct this foreign direct investment to areas where you would like to be a very prominent player in one specific number of value chains. It makes a lot of sense when you have a commodity that is sort of overwhelming your exports, for that commodity to be transformed locally. And you need to be very astute to be able to identify your entry points in a world where globalization has globalized value chains, and therefore, the opportunities are much more rare than they were when other countries and regions industrialize. But when you feel that one specific commodity has no chances of actually bringing you value addition, that's where your comparative advantage from a dynamic point of view enters into play. You will need to identify other things that maybe you will be better doing. And it's not impossible to actually think of value chains that look unattainable, but in fact, it all depends on determination. It all depends on the astuteness and the sophistication of the policymakers.
And there is a chapter on, or at least some sub chapters, resource curse, and actually it's not an inevitability.
No,
You can turn that resource into a positive force for change.
absolutely.
And in your closing, in your conclusions, you mentioned multilateralism is now facing legitimacy challenges, and you've spoken previously about the retreat of multilateralism today. So, is that an opportunity for the African continent, or on the contrary, it's a threat?
It can be a threat if we don't manage to have clarity in the way we engage. It can be a huge opportunity for Africa, because everybody now is going to be, sort of reviewing their premises, reviewing their regulatory systems, their different ways of engaging. Let's take just one example that I cover in the book a bit on artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is going to change a lot the way we produce, the way we measure productivity. And a lot of people would think that it's sort of a threat for jobs in Africa. But in fact, when you look into the demographic dimensions, and the book does that, you will realize that the more tech intensive processes and goods become, the more appealing they will be for younger population. And with the aging growing fast in the richest countries, they will need the youthness that Africa offers. So that's one aspect that is favorable. Another one is the fact that artificial intelligence is based on the idea that you can also steal intellectual property, because if you use data banks as a way of distilling your knowledge, you don't pay anything to those data banks. You mine them in the internet and elsewhere. And this is also going to destroy the current intellectual property regimes, and gives huge opportunities for Africa to enter into certain types of services with sort of a more democratized access than we could have imagined without artificial intelligence. So it depends very much on how, for each one of these different issues, Omar, we are capable of fostering the required capacities and opportunities are there. So it's just a matter of becoming quite smart in the way you approach.
Mm. Okay, so I've got a longish question, which is just as the EU's divide and rule is a challenge, I think the fact that some countries are lured on the other side, whether it's about EPAs or something else, before we discuss how this can be resolved, because it's a question, I wonder to what extent there is an acceptance that it is a problem. Politically, we all say regional integration is good, but when it comes to practice, reality, many things break down.
Yeah, my experience as a negotiator is that a lot of countries pay lip service to regional integration, so it's very good when it serves them. It's something they don't want to hear when they believe their interests are not fulfilled with such an approach. And there are lots of misconceptions about the unity of the continent and even the Pan-African ideology interpretation from an economic perspective. So a lot of North African countries believe that they have a privileged relationship with Europe. It's actually the opposite, but they realize that only when there are sort of crises, and they have no gain in having a different engagement than the rest of the continent. And South Africa also sometimes plays the big brother sort of attitude and trying to detach from the rest of the countries because they have a much more intense trade relationship with Europe. Just to discover that when new regulations are unilaterally imposed, they are the first to suffer. So we have to bring these different actors to understand that if they are serious about regional integration, the divide and rule only can have an opportunity and a life because of them, because they undermine African Union collective will. And we have a lot of decisions that are taken at the African Union. I was part of some that call for a much closer consultation amongst Africans before they engage other partners. But what do we see? On the trade front, we see every month one country in Africa signing a bilateral trade agreement with some country, which undermines completely the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. So this sort of two minds is responsible for the crisis and the opportunities lost, and we can't blame others for it. It's done by
Mm.
Africans.
So, I mean, related to this, so would you bemoan, for example, all the government to government meetings, the fora, the U.S. Africa Forum, the China Africa, so FOCAC, India Africa, etc. Is this undermining the AU, or there's a space and room for it?
Well, if we take into account the AU decisions, it is undermining AU decisions because there is a Banjul formula that has been approved at the AU summit in Banjul, that basically calls for a cross representation of the continent instead of engaging all countries in all summits and so forth. So this is forgotten because countries just respond to the invitations with their sovereign right. But the problem is that they don't have tactics, even going as a long as a large and long, sort of force. For instance, if we had a minimum of consultations, a modicum of consultations, it would have already been quite different. For instance, you go for FOCAC, the Forum Africa-China. Do we have any instance within the AU or within the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, for the instance, and that sort of makes positions clear about what the Africans are going to defend, and therefore they go and negotiate with the Chinese with the same rule book? No. It's sort of also another divide and rule. So Europe is sort of the showcase for that attitude, given the long colonial history in the book. But the book serves also as a demonstration that this applies to other partners as well.
So look, we'll take two more questions. I've got one around the G20. In your book, you say that in terms
Well, I advocated for G20 participation to include the African Union in 2011. So it was the first time I wrote about it, and I tried to promote that idea, demonstrating some of the arguments that have now become absolutely acceptable and that made India propose for the African Union to be admitted, and overwhelming consensus followed. So it's very clear that this is not a favor for a variety of reasons. First, because even if you count just on the criteria that is GDP related, you'll agree that if you have countries like Spain that are participating in the G20, if you have countries that have standing invitation like Singapore, there is no reason why Africa should not be at the table. Moreover, we all already know that there is an underestimation of the African GDP. All studies point in that direction, and each time that we do a rebasing exercise to determine the size of the GDP and its structure, because the year base has been left untouched for so long, we come to the conclusion that normally between 20 and 30% size was missed. So if we apply that for the entire continent that has not undertaken rebasing exercises and are late in their year-based of national accounts, we can easily consider that Africa has a GDP that is what is estimated. So it is important for economic determination. So Africa really should participate fully, but it should participate in a structured way. That's what I advocate in the book.
Fantastic. Look, maybe I'll take one last question and then we'll have to call this meeting to a close. I saw one in a second. The better deal you're advocating, don't you think it might be hindered and hampered by the lack of diplomatic and geopolitical clout African states are suffering from now? I think you sort of answered that question, but go ahead. We lack the diplomatic clout ultimately, so our hands are tied to some extent. But you dispute that.
I dispute that because I think it's more how we express our clout. For instance, a group of students was asking me what was the participation of Africa in the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030 of the UN. And then to their surprise, I was mentioning that, look, this agenda, the Agenda 2030 of the UN, is considered sort of the blueprint for the world engagements, including on climate. And it's much more ambitious in its goals, including eliminating poverty completely, just to mention one, than Agenda 2063. But what is the narrative out there? The narrative out there is that the agenda from Africa is too ambitious, number one, is too long. So the agenda of the UN is much shorter and more ambitious, but people think otherwise. So this is to prove that Africans are not capable of actually exercising their clout because they are not capable of controlling the narratives better. Um, because Agenda 2030 has been highly influenced by Agenda 2063. In fact, it was the first time that the African Union had a position about what was called post-2015 outcomes before the G77, which is the group of the Global South, and the G77 was obliged to adopt it fully because the Africans came first, and it was very difficult politically not to take them on board. And then, it was very difficult to ignore the Global South position in the larger negotiations. So the parts that concern Africa more specifically were all adopted. And the facilitator from the UN side was from the UN Secretariat side was an African. The government facilitators included an African. The financing for development the part that was another commission that contributed to the outcome was also with the presence of an African. So the Africans were all over. So this is proof of clout. But the narratives don't recognize that because we have not been able to master the art of communicating well. Partly because of this complex that continues to prevail, which is the fundamentals of the book. When you are in a self-deception trap, you are kind of minimized. Your clout comes as a consequence of that. So you are minimized, and unless you take your own destiny in your hands, and you can only do that by exercising agency in a complex world with much more sophistication and becoming much more smarter in the way you negotiate, you are likely to have sort of the results that we see. So that's why I wrote this book. It's basically to pass on this very fundamental message.
Fantastic. So I highly recommend the book. It's free to download, but you can also buy a hard copy. It's on the screen there. On just by Googling it, and you'll find the German publishers who will be able to send you a copy. But you can download it online as well. It's broken down into 9 different chapters, which are highly interesting. And as I said, it's a dissection of a number of important issues that are obviously very relevant today. So we talk about the vestiges of colonialism, but ultimately we look at it in terms of why they impact today's realities. There's also a in-depth deep dive on aid effectiveness, what it's done, and again the sort of the what you call the Good Samaritan complex, where well-intentioned charity is actually having the opposite effect. You tackle issues such as comparative advantage. You also obviously discuss the structural adjustment programs. We haven't had a chance to discuss those. Migration and population, and I thought that chapter was actually fascinating because the narrative today is completely dissociated from facts, basically. So the hysteria that we see in the media is completely is incorrect, and it's hysteria, and it's dissociated from from the truth and the facts. But it's evidence based, so there's lots of stats that are interesting. And actually, demographics. The more I think about it, I used to be worried about demographics, but actually, it's a source of strength, and we can definitely do. We'll definitely, if we're strategic, we can definitely benefit from this. The free trade fantasy, as I mentioned, you talked about Ricardo in the comparative advantage, and also the free trade fantasy in terms of why we're still suffering in terms of our the global regulatory and structural issues that are holding back the continent, and of course your conclusions, which calls for a new era of African agency. So thank you for your time, Prof. It was great actually to go into different topics that I hadn't thought about for a while, but ultimately they still resonate and are still highly important to how we think and how we engage with others. And it requires a rethink and a paradigm shift, and also a reality check from our side. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Omar, for the opportunity. It was great talking to you.
Thank you all.